You know, people did that research in the 60s and 70s. Originally, it was used to demonstrate that smaller meals are less lipogenic. I would argue that's because smaller meals would be lead to less insulin secretion in general. One interesting observation is that Japanese sumo wrestlers get massively fat. I don't know if they're clinically obese, eating 2 meals a day, which would suggest that they do it, that this method evolved because they can gain more fat eating 2 huge meals than they can eating 3 smaller meals or 3 smaller huge meals. By the way, they're unbelievably carb-rich and very low fat. They're like 12–16% fat is the fat content of the sumo wrestler diet. That said, afterwards, I didn't read the literature that closely. Afterwards, that idea kind of fell out of favor, and I have the feeling it's because further research suggested that it wasn't meaningful or wasn't true. So again, it's something that could probably be studied, could benefit from more study now, although I would surely think that the composition of those meals would be far more important than, this trying. I mean, it could have an effect in keeping in, I don't know, it's an interesting question. I doubt it's, in general, the evidence, the studies turned out to be ambiguous. It was considered compelling in the 60s and 70s, but by the 80s and 90s, it was less so.
A good friend of mine, Bill Banger, has developed a program called Bible. Maybe you're familiar with it, where he's attempting to teach preschool and kindergarten and first and second graders how to eat properly. Now, I don't know what that particular, what it means to eat properly. Maybe you got too much carbohydrate, but at any rate, this is an attempt to teach them proper eating habits and avoiding alcohol and tobacco and so forth. Did you anticipate that this would be a beneficial one?
That kids would benefit from that?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I think one effect whenever you teach proper eating, when any kind of diet trial, any type of study like that, one thing you're going to do is wean them off sweets. And like I said, fructose, both sucrose, table sugar is 50% fructose, 50% glucose. High fructose corn syrup is 55–45 or 55–42. So you could consider them until proven otherwise to be effectively identical. And one thing you do in any program to teach people to eat right, any diet trial, you put someone in a hospital, basically you're probably going to lower their sweet consumption, which means lower their fructose consumption, which will have, and if fructose indeed is the most lipogenic carbohydrate, they will lose some weight just from getting off sweets, even if the rest of their diet is still carbohydrate rich. But mostly, in general, one thing that worries me, like it's sacrilegious to say this, but I'm not sure that an apple isn't worse than a potato when it comes to getting fat because of the effect of the fructose in it. So the dependency, this idea that fruits and vegetables are absolute, certainly fruits, but are an absolute essential part of a healthy diet is the kind of thing that seems obvious, that sort of goes along with our religious beliefs. Nobody can imagine Adam and Eve actually, Adam hunting down an elk in the Garden of Eden and ripping its throat out and feeding Eve a raw limb. So we assume they lived on fruits and vegetables. But again, it's one of these things that's really never been studied. And there's reasons to believe that fruit in particular, certainly the juicier, sweeter fruits, the higher glycemic index fruits, are not doing our kids any favor either. So.
I wonder if you could comment a little bit more on that with the glycemic index and the role of, because of this role of insulin. There were some studies in the 60s that were later confirmed later corroborated, where they took volunteers and they had them eat a quarter pound of beef, and then they had them eat a quarter pound of beef plus some glucose. And what they found was that, as predicted, the insulin rise with just the beef alone compared to glucose alone. That was the the third arm, was much lower and slower. But the rise with glucose plus the beef was actually 3 times as high as with beef alone, with glucose alone. In other words, the combination of the high glycemic carbohydrate plus the amino acids actually triggered a much larger increase in insulin rise. And a similar or a related effect is that a lower glycemic index food such as an apple versus apple juice will cause a much lower and slower rise in insulin. And so I think that there might, I wonder if there's still a role for kind of good carbohydrates, those much lower in.
Yeah, I mean the fundamental issue here and the fundamental observation that I discuss in my book is actually the appearance of these diseases of civilization, diseases that associate with obesity. So diabetes, obesity, heart disease, cancer, gout, arthritis, a whole dental caries, a whole host of disease appearing in isolated populations that ate their traditional diets when they eat sugar and flour, white flour, which are the foods that were shipped around the world basically and traded originally because they're the ones you could ship around the world without them spoiling. So the basic observation, it emerged in the 1960s as this theory. It was a British theory that it's the refinement of the carbohydrates that make you fat. And the refinement of the carbohydrates, in effect, increases the glycemic index. So it takes foods that have a low glycemic index and it turns them into foods that are digested quickly, that have a much quicker effect on insulin. And the researcher who wrote this book, this fellow Peter Cleve, who should get enormous credit for his work and doesn't, said, look, it's not like any mechanism. It's not the pressure we apply to it. It's how dramatically that pressure is applied. So I could take a hammer and rest it on this table and it's not going to do any damage, but if I bang it every day with the hammer, it's going to break the table. And he's saying that's what happens when we refine carbs. And so the apple juice, you can drink in the course of 20 seconds the equivalent of 2 or 3 apples worth of fructose and sugar in effect, whereas you wouldn't eat 3 apples in a row. And if you did, it might take you a half an hour to do it. So one is sort of banging the pancreas, the other is this gentle effect. And that's very probably what's happening. The stimulation of insulin by protein and beef is an interesting question. I know it's getting a lot of play. There's bloggers who discuss them. And I say, are you Stephen? No. You could be. It's an interesting question. When you look at long-term effects, when you lower the carb content of a diet and increase the protein and fat content, you chronically decrease insulin secretion. So you're still left with this observation. There are differences between what happens in single meals and what happens in the long term. Weight gain is a long-term phenomenon, so I'm not interested actually that much. One of the places we've gone off, the research community went off the rails, is to be obsessed with this question of how much we eat and how satiated we get over the course of one meal or one day, where what we're interested in is how much our fat is accumulating over the course of weeks or months. So, if protein does, when you eat the high glycemic index carbs, you get an elevation in both blood sugar and insulin. When you eat, in the studies I've seen, like low-fat beef products, you get an increase in insulin but not blood sugar. And then when you switch and do long-term diets with high-protein, high-fat, low-carb diets, you get a chronic decrease, dramatic in insulin secretion. So in the long term, you're certainly going to let more fat out of the fat tissue by eating less carbs. And certainly there are good carbs versus bad carbs. Good carbs, the carbohydrates in green leafy vegetables take a long time to digest. There's actually a very small percentage of digestible carbohydrates in them, but the question always gets back to some people may not even be, if they do not want to be fat, they may not even be able to eat those. So it's a classic mistake made in this business is to assume that works for me as a lean individual also works for somebody who weighs 300 pounds. And the point is someone who weighs 300 pounds is physiologically and genetically different than somebody who doesn't. And we just don't know. We can't treat, one of the major problems of this field is it's full of people who, chronic exercisers, runners, and bicycle racers who all think that if everybody else just did what they did, they would also be lean. And everybody